We've been talking about the practices of yoga. Karma yoga, the path of action for the body; Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge for the intellect; and Bhakti yoga, the path of devotion for the mind. The question is, why do we implement these practices? Ultimately, the reason that we implement these practices is to achieve that state of permanent, unbroken bliss or satisfaction. So that goal, which is elsewhere known as enlightenment or self-realization, God realization, nirvana, all of these different terms are used. This is the absolute ideal, right? This is the end game. There's nothing else beyond that. For most people, for probably everyone you've met, the notion or the goal of self-realization or enlightenment it's too conceptually subtle to grasp. And it's a goal that it's such a high level of spiritual maturity that for most of us it's not something that is a reasonable goal to set. Okay, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say, for example, that you know someone who is 200 pounds overweight. They've never done any exercise in their life. They just sit on the couch, they flick around, they eat their snacks, and that's about it. That's their life. Now, such a person, all of a sudden, they watch the Olympics and they get all inspired. And they're watching the marathon. That's it. That's what I want to do. He wants to run a marathon. So he sets this goal of running a marathon, someone who's never done any physical activity in his life. That goal for him is too high. It's too far away. So what happens is there's an emotional enthusiasm that comes because of some sort of external stimulus. And so he gets this feeling, this temporary feeling, I want to run a marathon. But that feeling is not enough. Because think of it this way, the feeling was brought on quickly and suddenly by an external stimulus, watching the Olympics. Emotions that have that kind of quality, that are brought on very quickly by a stimulus, they can also leave very quickly when the stimulus changes. So this is why having an emotional reaction to something and then trying to set a goal is not a good idea, because the enthusiasm will not last for it. So when it comes to 6 a.m. and he's got to get up and start his jogging practice, their natural resistance to going through that pain will stop him. He won't want to do it because he won't be able to grasp again that enthusiasm for running a marathon because it's too far away for him. So what he needs to do instead is to set an ideal that is closer and that does have the effect of creating enough enthusiasm for him to act. Okay, so this is the purpose of an ideal. The purpose of an ideal is that it gives us an intellectual foothold, something that we can grasp and hold on to, and when we grasp it, there's an emotional enthusiasm that naturally flows. All right, so that's why I'll come back to another example in a moment. When the ideal is too high, what that means is the intellect can't really grasp it. It's too intellectually subtle, so we can't really get our head around it. As a result, we can't visualize it. It means that we're not drawn out of that state of resistance. We're not enthused to act towards the ideal. So this is one of the problems that happens when we set our ideal too high. It no longer inspires us. It might occasionally, but if we're going to use an ideal in life, it has to be something that we can consistently apply. There's no point occasionally wanting to do something and doing it. There's got to be consistency. You guys are all learning yoga. You're learning to be yoga teachers. Now imagine if every so often you practiced, just kind of whenever you felt like it. You'd be a pretty poor teacher. you've got to get yourself into a sustained, programmed schedule of practice. You've got to continue to do it over time. And so what is it that gets you to practice, that gets you to study when you perhaps don't want to? It's the ideal. So your ideal is, or your goal is, serving the community through being a yoga teacher, or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so all this is just the notion of the ideal and its purpose. So this is why I was saying at the beginning, that to set the ideal of self-realization, while it might be inspiring occasionally, it might have a sort of emotional reaction to it, it's not going to be something that most people can grasp and sustain over a long period of time. And so, when it comes to setting an ideal, it's important that we set an ideal that is relative. Right? So self-realization is the absolute ideal. If we set an ideal that is relative, what it means is it's closer to us. So it's like the overweight guy saying, okay, at least I want to be able to walk around the block twice without stopping. That's his much more relative ideal. That he can grasp. That is close enough to him that he wants to reach out and grab it. But if something's so far away, if it seems so far away to us, we don't even bother. It's only if it's just within arm's reach that we tend to reach forward for it. So this relative ideal that we can set for ourselves that has a much better effect on our growth is self-development. Okay, so self-realization is the absolute ideal. Self-development is the relative ideal. And the practices are the same. Path of action for the body, path of knowledge for the intellect, path of devotion for the mind. So we do the same thing. The only thing that's different is the goal of self-realization. The goal is no longer self-realization, it's self-development. Okay, so in terms of growth, etc., how have we defined or described what is growth, what is self-development? What is spiritual evolution or human maturity? Correct. Reduction of ego and egocentric desires. This is the marker, as it were. That's the thing that you can't actually measure it, but that's the thing that we measure, as it were, to find out what our level of development is. So the practice of spirituality, the practice of yoga, is the reduction of ego and egocentric desires and attachments. So when we set the goal of self-development, what we're talking about then is we are visualizing ourselves in a future state in which we are less egocentrically involved in our activities, that we're less driven by desire. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't use your desires. It doesn't mean you don't have your desires. You don't squash them. But the difference is, it's like the difference between driving a car and being a passenger in a car. Right now, if you're the passenger in a car and the person who's in the driver's seat decides to go 20 miles an hour over the speed limit and is driving recklessly and terrifyingly, you can't make him stop. You can ask him to stop, but if he says no, he'll just keep on doing it. Whatever he decides to do, you are going along for the ride. There's nothing you can do about it. You're helpless. All you can do is, wait for it to be over. But if you are driving the vehicle and all of a sudden you look down and you see your speed limit is 20 miles an hour over the limit, and you can sense yourself swerving between lanes unnecessarily, what can you do? Ease off the accelerator, slow down a bit, touch the brake. Now you're in control of where the car goes. You're in control of that power of the vehicle. So when we talk about the reduction of desires, the first stage of it is just to get into the driver's seat so that you're no longer being driven by the desire. If you want to use the desire, by all means go ahead. I have a desire to be a yoga teacher. Harness it. Get in the driver's seat and you decide. where that desire gets applied, how often, to what extent. So this is the first, if you want to call it, stage of development, is at least gaining some control over the desires. So it's a mark of maturity. The second aspect of self-development is the removal of desires per se. Okay, so the example that we were using to describe this was looking at the difference between yourself now and yourself as a child. So when you're a youngster, you're caught up. You have desire for toys. Right? You want toys, you want new toys, you want to play with other people's toys. If people take your toys off you, you are upset. You have this value for the toy world. You think that's where happiness lies. You don't even think it. It's just a pre-existing assumption for your life. That's where happiness is, so you go for toys. As you grow up, you become more mature. Naturally, those desires just fall away. Now when you look at toys, you can see what they're capable of offering, you can see what they can provide, but they no longer connect the circuit inside your personality. When you look at them, nothing happens. Whereas it used to be that when you looked at toys, that inner circuit was completed and you just, I want it. So this is a sort of psychological growth. You grow out of the toys. Where is the desire for toys now? It's gone. It doesn't exist. It's been eradicated. So this is the next, so that analogy is used to describe that next level or that next stage of spiritual development. It's growing out of the desires per se. So one thing is to have a desire for something and be controlled by it. The next thing is to still possess that desire, for it to still be present, but now you're in control of it. You decide how it gets used. The next thing is to grow out of the desire itself. So it no longer even asks you to do anything. Why bother? Okay, it's pretty easy to understand going from being controlled to being uncontrolled. Right? Nobody wants to feel that they're out of control. So if you've got control over your desires, it's a greater sense of autonomy and self-direction and all that kind of stuff. But if you've achieved that, what's the difference? Why bother going from being able to control a desire to getting rid of it entirely? Unbroken happiness. All right. So then what we're saying is that the eradicating of a desire has a direct connection to the subjective well-being that you experience moment to moment. Your happiness, your peace, your bliss. The removal of a desire is commensurate with a lifting of the sense of freedom and peace that you experience in the world. So we can use another analogy to try and illustrate this. Imagine someone who's a smoker, addicted, controlled by the desire. Spends some time, gets to a point where, I can take it or leave it. Yeah, I've got the desire for it, but if I say no, I say no, and I go back to it maybe once or twice, but that's it. So he's got some control over the desire. It's there, it doesn't bother him, it doesn't bug him, but he enjoys a cigarette when he has it and so on and so forth. You go from that state to completely getting rid of the desire. Now that whole dimension of life has been removed from his awareness. There is an increase in the overall mental peace in his own mind. That thought, go have a cigarette. What about a cigarette? That's been removed. Shave all your hair off. I'm not asking you to, but if you shave all your hair off, what do you no longer have to think about? Your hair. What it looks like, what colour it is, washing it, conditioning it, drying it. It does not enter your awareness at all. That whole thought flow, that whole dimension of life has been taken from you. Now, it might sound like something's been taken away, but the only thing that's been taken away is this excessive lava flow. He uses this term in the Gita, this lava flow of thoughts about something. What we need to understand is that it is that preoccupation with the various aspects of the world that creates the mental agitations on the surface of the mind. So we were using that analogy at another time. How do you describe a calm, peaceful lake?
Still waves.
No waves.
No waves.
Yeah, no ripples.
No ripples.
So a peaceful lake is one that has no ripples. A peaceful mind is one that has no ripples. So every time you remove a desire, what you're doing is you're taking another set of ripples out of the mind. That is subjectively experienced as peace. So the removal of desires is to give us that sense of freedom and peace that we are looking for. How do we normally get that sense of peace and freedom? What do we normally do? Go after it. Cigarette, 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 cigarette. There's all these agitations. So what do? I have a cigarette. All those agitations drop. When the agitations drop, I experience a lift. I experience peace, I experience relaxation, I experience happiness. So we get rid of the agitations by contacting the external world and get peace. The problem with that is they keep coming back. Have another cigarette. It's not like I have a cigarette once and think that was great, that peace was wonderful, don't need to have it again. No. It keeps coming back. So if you remove the desire for cigarettes, then you gain that peace permanently. So this is why we do it. Self-development is the direction of the removal of desires. The end game of the whole thing is self-realization. And so the conclusion that I'm drifting towards here is that whatever else we're doing in life, whatever our study and career options are, our family life, our social life, our service to the community, that aspect, everything that we're doing, if we include in there the ideal of self-development, then every domain of life is enhanced.